I thought I was only helping with firewood, but when she looked at me and said, "Stay, I need more help inside," everything changed. The afternoon was calm, the kind of quiet where you can hear your own breath between the echo of every strike of the axe. I had been outside for almost an hour, splitting logs in neat stacks against the side of her house. The rhythm had become almost meditative, wood cracking clean under my swing, the earthy scent of pine filling the cool air. Sweat clung to my back, my shirt sticking slightly with each movement, but I didn't mind. There was something satisfying in the simple work of it, something grounding. I wasn't expecting company, certainly not hers. She appeared in the doorway, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. She didn't call my name at first. She just stood there for a moment, leaning against the frame, sunlight slipping past her and catching the soft strands of her hair. There was a steadiness about her, but also something else. A flicker of hesitation, almost as though she was debating whether to speak at all. When she finally did, her voice carried over the distance with a warmth that caught me off guard. "Stay," she said, not as a question, but as a gentle insistence. "I need more help inside." The axe paused mid-swing in my hands. For a moment, I wasn't sure if I'd heard her correctly. It was the way she said it, calm, deliberate, but touched with a quiet vulnerability that made me lower the axe and wipe my palms on my jeans. She didn't look away, didn't fill the silence with unnecessary words. She simply waited, her gaze steady, her presence soft yet commanding. I walked toward her, my boots crunching over the gravel, and in those few steps my thoughts tangled. Why me? Why now? She had always seemed self-sufficient, someone who carried herself with a grace that suggested she never really needed anyone. And yet, here she was asking me to stay. When I reached the doorway, she moved slightly aside to let me pass, and in that brief space between us, our arms brushed. It was nothing, just fabric against fabric, but it sent a current through me stronger than I cared to admit. Inside, the air was cooler, filled with the faint scent of brewed coffee and something floral I couldn't quite place. She closed the door behind us, the quiet thud sealing the world outside. For a second, we just stood there. Her hand rested lightly on the frame, her eyes searching mine in a way that made my chest tighten. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even overt. But in that small, ordinary moment, something shifted. I realized this wasn't about moving a box or fixing a shelf. It wasn't about chores or convenience. There was something unspoken in the air between us, subtle but undeniable, and I could feel it pressing closer with every heartbeat. I didn't ask what she needed help with. I simply nodded, willing to follow her lead, caught between curiosity and a pull I couldn't name. And as she turned and walked deeper into the house, I knew, without fully understanding why, that stepping inside had changed more than just the air around me. The shift from the outdoors to the inside of her house felt almost like entering another world. Outside, the air had been sharp with the bite of wood and earth, but in here, it was gentler, warm with the faint aroma of coffee and something faintly sweet, maybe cinnamon. I wiped the back of my neck instinctively, still carrying the heat of the work I'd been doing, while she moved ahead of me, her steps unhurried, measured, almost as if she was deciding how close to let me follow. The living room was cozy, though lived in. Boxes were stacked neatly against the wall, a few books scattered on a table as if left mid-thought, and sunlight filtered through sheer curtains, painting golden patches across the floorboards. She turned, a box in her hands already, and gave me a smile that was both casual and layered with something deeper, something I couldn't quite place. "Could you help me move these?" "They're heavier than I thought," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her face with the back of her wrist. I stepped forward, reaching for the box before she could strain herself. Our fingers brushed for only a second, but it was enough for me to notice the warmth of her hand, the soft strength behind it. I lifted it easily, setting it down where she pointed, but the weight I felt had little to do with the box. The work itself was simple, shifting furniture a little, carrying stacks from one corner to another, but it was the closeness that made it feel different. Each time I passed her in the narrow hallway, our shoulders grazed. Each time she pointed out where something belonged, her hand rested briefly on my arm or the small of my back, guiding me with a casualness that felt deliberate in ways I couldn't admit aloud. We talked as we worked, but not about anything profound, at least not on the surface. She asked about my classes, my plans for the week, the kind of questions you ask without much thought. But beneath her words, I felt something else, a curiosity, maybe even a careful testing of how much I would share. I found myself answering more openly than I expected, my guard slipping each time her laugh filled the room. There was a moment, quiet but unforgettable, when we both reached for a small wooden box on the shelf. My hand closed over hers, firm but gentle, and for a beat too long, neither of us moved. Her eyes lifted to mine, steady, unreadable, but with the faintest glimmer of something I couldn't mistake. Then, just as quickly, she withdrew, letting me take the box, her lips curving into a smile that felt like both a dismissal and an invitation. The house, though ordinary, carried an intimacy I hadn't felt before. Every sound, the creak of the floorboards, the brush of fabric as we moved, felt amplified. And with each task completed, I felt less like a helper and more like someone she had allowed into her private world, her personal space. When we finally paused, she brushed her hands together and looked at me with a softness that lingered longer than it should have. "Thank you," she said simply, but the way she said it carried more weight than the words themselves. And I knew then, this wasn't just about boxes or furniture. Something deeper was unfolding, subtle and quiet, hidden in the way we moved around each other. By the time we had moved the last stack into place, the house seemed lighter, less cluttered, more open. She exhaled with a satisfied little smile, brushing her palms together as if to dust away the work we'd finished. Then, almost as though it was the most natural thing in the world, she tilted her head toward the kitchen. "Come on," she said softly, "you've earned a break." "Coffee?" I followed her into the kitchen, where sunlight spilled across the counter, catching on the steam rising from the kettle. The air smelled of roasted beans and something faintly sweet, cookies maybe. She moved with an easy grace, filling mugs, the sound of pouring water mixing with the patter of rain now starting to hit the windows. I sat at the small wooden table, resting my arms on its smooth surface, and watched her. There was nothing overtly dramatic in the moment, yet something about the quiet rhythm of it felt strangely intimate, like I had stepped into a life I wasn't sure I was meant to see. She set a mug in front of me, her fingers brushing mine as she let go. A simple gesture, yet it sent a warmth through me that had nothing to do with the coffee itself. She sat opposite, her elbows lightly resting on the table, chin tilted into her hand. For a moment, we just looked at each other, neither rushing to fill the silence. It was me who broke it, joking lightly about how she probably could have managed all the boxes without me. She laughed, an unguarded, genuine laugh that made the room feel brighter. But just as quickly, that laughter turned into a small accident. She reached for the sugar jar, and the lid slipped, scattering crystals across the table. We both scrambled at once, hands bumping, shoulders colliding as we tried to brush the mess into a neat little pile. It was clumsy, ridiculous, and the kind of thing you might normally forget, but the way we laughed in that moment, almost breathless with amusement, was something I knew I wouldn't forget at all. Her hand lingered on mine a beat too long as we tried to steady the jar again. This time, neither of us pulled away quickly. The laughter faded, replaced by something quieter, heavier, more deliberate. Her eyes softened, the corners of her smile gentling into something fragile. "I don't laugh like that much anymore," she admitted quietly, her voice carrying a weight the smile couldn't hide. I didn't know what to say at first. But I leaned in, listening, offering the only thing I could, my attention. She told me, not in detail, but enough about how life had grown quieter for her in recent years, how the house sometimes felt too big, too silent. She didn't frame it as loneliness, but I heard it there, tucked between her pauses. I nodded slowly, feeling the truth of her words settle into me. "You deserve to laugh like that more often," I said softly, surprising myself with the honesty of it. Her lips pressed together, her eyes flickering down before meeting mine again. There was something vulnerable in that gaze, something that reached out and held me without touch. The rain outside thickened against the glass, but in that kitchen, It was just us, two people holding a fragile, unspoken connection over spilled sugar and steaming cups. And as we sat there, I realized this was no longer about helping with chores. It was about something deeper. The way two lives can brush against each other and quietly change the rhythm of an ordinary afternoon. The laughter from the kitchen still lingered faintly in my chest when I noticed the first sound of raindrops. At first it was gentle, a soft patter against the window panes, but within minutes it had deepened into something heavier, steadier, a storm rolling in fast. The air inside grew dimmer, the glow of the lamps pushing back against the gray that pressed at the glass. She glanced toward the window with a small frown, as if the rain had interrupted a plan only she knew about. "Well," she said quietly, "looks like you're not going anywhere for a while." There was no accusation in her voice, no disappointment, just a statement of fact. Yet the words stirred something in me. The storm outside, the closed door behind us, the quiet shelter of the house, it all seemed to draw an invisible circle around the two of us. She busied herself with a stack of folded laundry in the living room, trying to make use of the sudden confinement. I offered to help, but she waved me off with a little smile. "I've got this." But her voice trailed for a second before she added, softer, "Stay close." I moved to stand beside her anyway, reaching to lift a basket that looked too heavy for her. She let out a quiet sigh, half amusement, half surrender. "You don't have to do everything," she murmured, but when my hand brushed hers as we folded a blanket together, she didn't pull away. The storm thickened, rain hammering against the roof, thunder rumbling somewhere in the distance. The sound wrapped around us like a cocoon, shutting out the rest of the world. She paused at one point, holding a shirt in her hands, staring at it as though lost in thought. Her shoulders dropped slightly, and I saw the weight of something unspoken settle over her. Without thinking, I stepped closer, my hand resting lightly against her back. Not firm, not insistent, just a quiet presence. She looked up at me, her expression softened by surprise, and for a moment we simply stood there, breathing in the charged silence. It wasn't a grand moment, nothing cinematic. Just the two of us, standing in a dimly lit room with the storm pressing hard against the windows, my hand still against the fabric of her sweater, her eyes searching mine. And yet, the air between us felt alive, thick with something unspoken. She was the first to break it, letting out a small laugh, shaking her head as though trying to dismiss the weight of it all. "This weather," she said, folding the shirt carefully, "always finds a way to trap you." Her words were light, but her voice carried a tremor that betrayed more. I didn't press. Instead, I helped her with the rest of the laundry, our movements weaving in and out of each other's space, each brush of skin or shared glance amplified by the storm outside. It felt as though the rain itself had pushed us closer, shrinking the distance until there was no way to ignore the quiet tension building between us. By the time we set the last folded stack aside, the house felt smaller, warmer, and impossibly still. And though the thunder still rolled beyond the walls, the real storm, I realized, was here inside, between the two of us. By the time evening settled in, the storm had softened. The rain still tapped at the windows, but now it was more of a lullaby than a threat. The house had taken on a different kind of warmth, lamplight glowing softly in the corners, the air holding the faint smell of brewed coffee and the rain-damp air drifting in through a cracked window. She suggested we sit for a while, and I followed her into the living room. She lowered herself into an armchair, but then, almost second-guessing, shifted to the couch instead. It was a small decision, but it left just enough room for me to sit beside her. I did, careful to leave a respectful space, though not so much that it felt distant. For a few minutes, neither of us said much. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of awareness of the day's unspoken moments. She sat with her hands loosely clasped in her lap, her gaze fixed on the window, where droplets slid slowly down the glass. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and thoughtful. "It gets quiet here at night," she said. "Too quiet sometimes." I turned slightly, watching her profile as she spoke. The strength she usually carried in her posture seemed softened now. There was something vulnerable in her tone, something she didn't often show. "Doesn't seem like the kind of quiet you enjoy," I said gently. She gave a faint smile at that, but it didn't reach her eyes. No. It's the kind of quiet that reminds you of what's missing. She paused, her fingers tightening slightly against each other. Life has a way of surprising you. Things change. People go. And you're left with all this space you never thought you'd have to fill alone. The weight of her words settled in the room. I didn't rush to answer. Instead, I let the silence stretch just long enough to honor what she'd said. When I finally spoke, it was quieter than I intended. I don't think anyone deserves to feel that kind of emptiness. Her eyes shifted to mine then, meeting me fully for the first time in what felt like hours. There was something searching in her gaze, as if she were testing the sincerity of my words. I didn't look away. I couldn't. Without realizing it, my hand had shifted closer on the couch cushion until it rested near hers. Not touching, just near. She noticed. Slowly, almost hesitantly, she let her fingers drift until the backs of them brushed lightly against mine. The contact was so small, so subtle, and yet it carried more meaning than any words could. We sat like that, fingers barely touching, as if both of us were afraid to move too quickly and break whatever fragile thread had been spun between us. The ticking of a clock somewhere in the house filled the silence, steady and grounding, but all I could focus on was the warmth of her skin against mine. She exhaled softly, almost a sigh, and leaned back into the couch. Her head tilted slightly, close enough that I could feel the faint brush of her hair near my shoulder. The intimacy wasn't in grand gestures, it was in these quiet, fragile admissions, both spoken and unspoken. And in that moment, I realized something simple, yet undeniable. I wasn't just keeping her company. I was being led into a part of her life she didn't often show. A part that trusted me enough to be seen. The storm had passed by the time we drifted into the kitchen again. The air carried that fresh, damp scent that follows heavy rain, and the windows were streaked with silver trails where the water had raced down earlier. She moved quietly, almost deliberately, pulling ingredients from the pantry. I offered to help, and though she laughed at first, she handed me a cutting board and a knife, as though she'd been waiting for me to ask. We prepared a simple meal together, nothing extravagant, just bread, cheese, and a pot of soup simmering on the stove. Yet the act of sharing the space, moving around each other in the small kitchen, felt layered with something unspoken. Our elbows brushed as we chopped vegetables, our hands reached for the same utensil more than once, and each time, neither of us pulled away as quickly as we should have. There was one moment in particular that lingered. She leaned across me to reach for a spoon, and for the briefest second, her hand rested against my arm to steady herself. The touch was so natural, so casual, and yet my heart responded with a sharp, uninvited rhythm. She noticed. I know she did, because her breath caught, and she hesitated before pulling back, the spoon clinking softly against the pot as she stirred. We didn't talk much as the soup simmered. The quiet was comfortable yet charged. Every so often, I caught her watching me, her eyes thoughtful, almost conflicted, as though weighing something she hadn't decided she was ready to say. And when our gazes met, there was always that tiny pause, that lingering second where neither of us looked away. Dinner was ready sooner than expected. We set the table together, our movements slower now, deliberate, as though dragging out the task so the moment wouldn't arrive too quickly. She placed a bowl in front of me, her hand brushing against mine again, and this time, the silence that followed was unmistakably heavy. When we sat, the warmth of the meal filled the air, but I barely tasted the first bite. My focus was on her, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the way her fingers rested lightly against the rim of her bowl, the way she seemed to be holding back words that pressed at the edge of her lips. She set her spoon down, exhaling quietly. "Sometimes I forget what it feels like," she said, her eyes on the table. I tilted my head. What feels like? Her gaze lifted slowly, meeting mine with a softness that stopped me in place. Just having someone here. Someone who listens. Someone who sees me. The weight of her confession filled the space between us. I wanted to answer, to say something that would reassure her, but the words caught. Instead, I simply reached across the table, letting my fingers brush against hers, tentative, waiting. She didn't pull away. Instead, her hand turned slightly, her fingertips resting against mine, fragile yet certain. The room felt still, as though the world outside had hushed to allow this one moment. We didn't move further, didn't say the words aloud. But in the quiet, in the shared glances and hesitant touches, the truth settled over us both. We knew. We knew, and we didn't need to rush it. The soup bowl sat empty on the table, though neither of us had hurried through the meal. We ate slowly, speaking little, our silence filled with something richer than words. The storm had long since drifted away, leaving the night calm and still. The only sounds were the faint ticking of the kitchen clock and the occasional creak of the house settling into quiet. She leaned back against the couch now, her posture softer than it had been all day. A lamp glowed in the corner, washing the room in warm, golden light. I sat beside her, not too close, not too far, the careful distance of two people who knew how much space mattered and how much it didn't. For a while, we just sat like that, letting the calm settle around us. Then, almost imperceptibly, she shifted closer. Her arm brushed mine, light as air, and though she didn't move away, she also didn't look at me right away. Instead, she kept her eyes on the window where raindrops still clung to the glass like tiny jewels in the lamplight. "You know," she said softly, "I didn't expect today to feel like this." I turned toward her, careful. "Like what?" Her lips curved into a faint smile, though her eyes held something more fragile. "Full. It's been a long time since I've felt a day filled me this much. I thought it would just be chores and rain." She paused, then glanced at me, her gaze holding mine in a way that said far more than her words ever could. I felt the air thicken with all the things neither of us had dared say aloud. My heart beat louder, but I didn't rush, didn't lean in. Instead, I let my hand rest on the couch cushion, close enough that if she wanted to, she could close the gap. She did. Slowly, deliberately, her hand found mine, her fingers resting lightly against my palm before curling just enough to anchor there. It wasn't bold, it wasn't dramatic, but it was everything. We stayed like that, our joined hands resting quietly between us. After a long silence, she let out a soft laugh, almost shy. "What happens now?" The question lingered in the air, fragile, uncertain. I could have promised her everything in that moment, but it didn't feel right to rush. Instead, I squeezed her hand gently, grounding us in the present. "Maybe nothing has to happen just yet," I said. "Maybe we just let this be enough for tonight." Her eyes softened, and for the first time all day, I saw her shoulders release their quiet tension. She leaned her head lightly against my shoulder, her hair brushing against my neck. The closeness was simple, safe, and yet it held more meaning than any grand gesture could. We sat like that until the clock chimed softly in the corner. Neither of us moved, unwilling to break the quiet spell the night had given us. And in that stillness, I knew that whether tomorrow brought more or less, this moment would stay with me. Because sometimes, the most lasting connections don't need fireworks or declarations. Sometimes, they're found in the quiet, two people side by side, sharing nothing more than the simple certainty of being seen.